Hey guys, so we're going to look at how the Middle Ages and the Renaissance compared to one another because they are in steep contrast. Because the whole point of this document activity is to really look at how the Renaissance was a change in man's thinking. So when we're looking at that question, what we're really trying to understand was what was different about the Renaissance and the way that mankind approached the world. And how that was different from the Middle Ages. So we have quite a few things that we already know about both of these from the notes that we've previously taken. So I just want to kind of take some time here to go through and kind of remember those things. So we're going to start with the Middle Ages first, and then we'll move over to the Renaissance kind of as we add things. So in the Middle Ages, one of the things that we know the best is that the Middle Ages was a time in which there was a really big interest in religion. There was that big focus there on how God's kind of played in. The church played a really big role because it was the stabilizing power in Europe during the Middle Ages. In contrast, in the Renaissance, there was an interest in humanism, which we know to be this interest in human achievement and more secular matters. So secular meaning non-religious. And we'll kind of put humanism here, the human achievement there, okay? So one of the other things that we know about the Middle Ages is we're going to, specifically with this document activity, we're going to be looking at literature, art, and science. And so we're going to look specifically at those from the Middle Ages. One of the things that we talked about in the Middle Ages is that literature tended to have, because of that interest in religion, tended to be religious in nature. What we kind of things that they wrote would have been hymns, sermons, things like that. So they didn't have a tendency to write anything that was non-religious. In contrast, in the Middle Ages, literature tended to be focused on the human experience. And emotions, which leads us into Shakespeare, novels, plays, and things of that nature. Literature was much more focused on humanism and the human achievement. In contrast, scientific discoveries during the Middle Ages tended to be few and far in between. Very few, because that was not what their focus was. They were also understood as part of religion, which kind of leads us into discoveries like, for example, geocentric theory, which was that theory that God made the earth, and therefore the earth is at the center of the universe. In contrast, in the Renaissance, scientific discoveries are based on human observation and actual science, and so these scientific discoveries kind of expand, which is how we get heliocentric theory finally being accepted. This also has a tendency to do with the fact that now Greek and Roman kind of scientific discoveries were more accepted, and the Greeks actually had heliocentric theory. However, it was not widely accepted. Other part of this is art. So art was religious in nature. In the Middle Ages, it's two-dimensional, meaning that it did not have that 3D quality to it. And art in the Renaissance is focused on the human experience, portraits, and it was three-dimensional, using perspective as the main technique that they're going to use during the Renaissance. Okay. Other things to kind of keep in mind here was the culture. So during the Middle Ages, life was dark, it was cold, it's very limited due to feudal agreements. People are not moving very often around. And then the opposite is true during the Renaissance. People are more free to move. People are actually moving to more urban areas, and that is kind of the big focus there. Again, during the Middle Ages, they had that feudal system, so that meant that serfs were limited to their land. There was very, very little economic mobility, meaning that people did not move between the social classes very often. In the Renaissance, there's still not a ton of economic mobility. However, trade increases with the introduction of banks and credit, which does allow for some economic mobility more so than in the Middle Ages. There's also lots of war during the Middle Ages. Think the Crusades and things of that nature, the Germanic invasions, which caused lots of issues there. Learning is limited to the monks. There's not going to be a lot of universities. Charlemagne is going to establish schools, but they're mainly going to be limited to churchgoers. Other thing we see in the Middle Ages here is that there is a lack of trade. So people are staying on their feudal, kind of in their feudal systems, in their kingdoms. There's not going to be a ton of trade in between different kingdoms. There also, as a result of feudalism, there's going to be smaller kingdoms with king's power based upon the church. So the church is going to have that influence on these kingdoms. Think like Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, things of that nature. Meanwhile, in the Renaissance, more nations emerge. So we see the building of nation states, such as Britain and Spain and France, with powers based upon Machiavelli's philosophy and principles. And so they're no longer going to be dependent on the church. There still is a connection between those rulers and the church, but it's not quite the same as it was during the Middle Ages, where there was a strong church influence here. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that there's very few books, okay, because they did not have a printing press. All books were written by hand, which led to books being very expensive and also kind of limited the learning that people were able to do. During the Renaissance, we see the introduction of the printing press makes books cheaper and easier to obtain, which also increases the overall literacy rate amongst the regular public, which is important because that is what's going to raise the learning in general. There's quite a few other things we could put on here. One of the things that I missed here that I do want to go back and add is that universities in the Renaissance start to be established. And as a result, learning is expanded, because we talked about how in the Middle Ages you have just the monks doing a lot of the learning, but in the Renaissance it's really a freedom that's given to a lot more people. Generally speaking, only the rich, but it's still expanded a lot more than it had been. There's lots of other things we could put on here. I'm sure that I missed a few, but these are kind of the main ones that I want to focus in on, that the theme of religion in the Middle Ages and how there was a lack of learning because it was very limited, the lack of mobility, lack of trade because of those feudal agreements, the smaller kings really having their power based upon the church, and in the Renaissance that focus on humanism and how secular and humanistic thoughts really had an impact on literature, on art, on science. There's a lot more trade occurring, and there's a lot more centralized power in those kings and queens in those nation states, and how they're making these new inventions like the printing press are really expanding learning. So that's a real big focus here between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And these are things that you can use when we actually get to the writing of the essay. They're not going to be things, there may be things that we focus on in the documents, but they also may not. But this is all evidence that you could potentially use in your essay to kind of build upon these points. We'll be back in the next video looking at literature specifically in the Renaissance and how it was different from the Middle Ages.